When professional cave expeditions make remarkable discoveries, it often sparks curiosity among even the most inexperienced cavers. What starts as a quest for discovery turns into a deadly struggle for survival. Alone and facing the unforgiving depths, his journey becomes a nightmare. This is the tragic story of Sergey Hozeev and the Veryovkina Cave on Shadows of Tragedy. At over 1.3 miles deep, Veryovkina Cave is the deepest known cave on Earth. Located in the remote Caucasus Mountains of Abkhazia, Russia, it is a sprawling labyrinth of tunnels and vertical drops, with treacherous sumps and freezing underground rivers. For Sergey Hozeev, a 37-year-old father and adventurer, the cave represented the ultimate challenge. Sergey was not a novice when it came to adventure. He was an experienced climber, marathon runner, and avid hiker. Despite having only been caving few times before, he became captivated by Veryovkina. He spent nearly a year gathering information about the cave, reading articles, collecting maps, and studying expedition reports. Among the most striking stories was that of the Plura team, a seasoned Russian caving group who had narrowly survived a disaster in the cave in 2018. During their expedition in 2018, a sudden flood surged through the cave, nearly trapping 8 members of the Plura team, including National Geographic photographer Robbie Schoen. They had been in the lowest base camp, more than a mile below the surface, when the water roared in. With just minutes to spare, they gathered what essentials they could and fled to higher ground, climbing a vertical shaft while torrents of water pummeled them from above. Schoen described it as one of the most terrifying moments of his life. But for Sergey, the danger made the challenge even more irresistible. On November 1st, 2020, Sergey left his home in Sochi, Russia, telling his family he was heading out for a week-long journey to find the meaning of life. His destination was the world's deepest cave, Veryovkina. He carried with him only basic climbing gear, a headlamp, and enough food for a few days. But unlike the well-prepared teams that had explored the cave before him, Sergey ventured alone, without notifying anyone of his exact plans. Veryovkina is a cave that shows no mercy. Temperatures within its depths hover around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the cave's relentless humidity ensures that it remains cold, wet, and treacherous. Descending is just the beginning. For Sergey, a solo ascent would be a far more grueling and dangerous task. Sergey's first challenge was the descent to Camp 1, a mere 1,250 feet below the surface. While it may sound manageable, this section of the cave is notorious for its jagged walls and sharp turns, leaving Sergey with little room to maneuver. After hours of descent, Sergey finally reached the first camp. This camp, once used by the Plura team, was little more than a rest stop, an empty space where teams could regroup before heading deeper into the cave. For Sergey, it was a moment of brief relief, but the hardest challenges still lay ahead. Sergey's goal was simple: reach the bottom of the cave, explore, and return to the surface. But as he prepared for the next leg of the journey, the difficulty of what lay ahead would soon become all too clear. The Baba Yaga Pit, a name that echoes both folklore and fear, is one of the most daunting challenges in the Veryovkina Cave. A 500-foot sheer vertical drop, it is one of the largest free-hanging descents in any cave system on Earth. For Sergey, standing at the edge of this massive pit, the enormity of the challenge would have been overwhelming. Unlike the tighter passages above, the Baba Yaga Pit offers no places to rest, no ledges to pause on, and no easy way back up. Climbers must rely on a single rope, descending hundreds of feet without interruption. The ropes left by the Plura team allowed Sergey to make his descent, but what Sergey didn't realize was that climbing back up would require foot stirrups, a critical piece of equipment he hadn't brought with him. Lowering himself into the pitch-black cavern, Sergey would have felt the weight of the cave pressing down on him. The walls of the shaft closed in, leaving him hanging in isolation, with only his headlamp casting faint flickering light onto the jagged walls. Sergey eventually reached the bottom of the Baba Yaga Pit, but the descent had taken a toll on him. Now nearly 2,000 feet below the surface, He was deeper in the earth than he had ever been before, with no easy way back to the surface. After completing the harrowing descent down the Baba Yaga pit, Sergey reached Camp 2. This camp, like the others before it, had been used by professional caving teams as a base to prepare for the next stage of the journey. But for Sergey, alone and without a team to rely on, this was no longer just a resting point. It was a stark reminder of how far he had come, and how far he still had to go. The journey to Camp 2 had taken hours, and Sergey's strength was waning. His food supplies were beginning to run low, and the cold, damp air of the cave was seeping into his bones. Without proper thermal protection, the constant exposure to near-freezing temperatures was slowly draining his body's energy. And though he had made it this far, the most challenging part of his expedition was yet to come: the climb back up the Baba Yaga pit, a feat that would be nearly impossible without the proper equipment. It was here that Sergey might have made a devastating realization. The climb back up the Baba Yaga pit would require foot stirrups, gear he didn't have. Without them, climbing a 500-foot vertical shaft with just his arms was physically impossible. Exhaustion, cold, and hunger were setting in. Sergey had to make a choice: attempt the ascent again, knowing the likelihood of success was slim, or descend further into the cave, hoping to find supplies or an alternate way out. Desperate and running out of options, Sergey made the decision to continue descending into the depths of Veryovkina. His map indicated that the next camp, Camp 3, was located 1,300 feet below Camp 2. He knew it would be a grueling journey. If you're finding this story intriguing, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more captivating content. The descent to Camp 3 was unforgiving. Sergey's body was already weak from hunger and cold, and the cave's tight passages made every step a battle. Water trickled through the cave's walls, turning the floor into a slippery, uneven surface. The air was thick with humidity, and at just 40 degrees, hypothermia was beginning to set in. But with no other options, Sergey forced himself to keep going. Camp 3 was nearly 3,300 feet below the surface. Reaching it alone, without the support of a team, would have been a monumental challenge for even the most experienced caver. But Sergey made it. Exhausted, cold, and desperate, he arrived at the small, damp camp, hoping that he would find supplies left by previous expeditions. Sergey's arrival at Camp 3 was a small victory, but it was not the salvation he had hoped for. The camp, once used by the Perovo Speleo team, was barren. No food, no supplies, no tools to help him ascend. His last hope for survival had faded. By this point, Sergey's body was beginning to shut down. The lack of food and constant exposure to the cold had left him weak and disoriented. His cotton overalls, soaked from the wet passages, offered no protection against the cave's biting cold. And with no gas lamps for warmth, his body could no longer maintain its core temperature. With no way to ascend and no supplies to sustain him, Sergey faced a grim reality. Descending even further into the cave might be his only option. Camp 4 was over 1,000 feet below, and though the journey would be nearly impossible in his weakened state, it was his last hope. In one final, desperate attempt to survive, Sergey would have made the decision to descend further into the cave, hoping to find supplies at the next camp, Camp 4. It was a gamble, one that would push him to the very edge of his endurance. The deeper Sergey went, the harder the journey became. His body, already weakened by hypothermia and exhaustion, struggled to keep moving. The cave's cold, damp air was unforgiving, and the physical toll of navigating the tight, jagged passages was immense. Sergey knew that with every step deeper into the cave, his chances of survival were diminishing. Exactly what happened to Sergey during those final moments remains unknown. Some believe he succumbed to hypothermia, his body too weak to continue. Others think he may have fallen, disoriented by exhaustion and the overwhelming darkness. But whatever the cause, Sergey's journey came to a tragic end, alone, deep within the earth. Back in November 2020, when Sergey failed to return home after a week, his wife grew increasingly worried. With no clear indication of where he had gone, Her only option was to report him missing to local authorities. But the search was not successful. Sergey had left no trace of his plans, and no one knew he had ventured into the world's deepest cave. For months, she held out hope that Sergey might return, perhaps delayed by a miscalculation or an injury. But as the weeks turned to months, her hope began to fade. Little did she know Sergey had perished deep within Veryovkina Cave, his body trapped in the darkness far beyond anyone's reach. It wasn't until August of 2021, 9 months after Sergey's disappearance, that the Veryovkina team discovered the tragic outcome of his expedition. As they descended into the cave for a new expedition, they found evidence of an unauthorized caver, trekking poles, crampons, and a cloth backpack left behind. At 3,600 feet, the team made a devastating discovery. Sergey's body, hanging lifeless from the ropes, deep within the cave. His body had been there for months, preserved by the cold, damp conditions of the cave. The Veryovkina team was devastated, but they knew that retrieving his body would be no easy task. Retrieving Sergey's body from the depths of Veryovkina was nearly impossible. The cave's narrow squeezes, steep vertical drops, and treacherous conditions meant that a traditional rescue operation was out of the question. The team faced a grim reality. There was no way to bring his body out whole. The tight, winding passages and sheer distances would make transporting a full body nearly impossible without endangering the rescue team themselves. The only option was to dismember his remains into smaller, manageable pieces. This difficult and painful decision weighed heavily on the rescue team, but it was the only way to safely transport Sergey's body through the treacherous cave system. It took weeks of planning and coordination, involving over 100 people to bring him back to the surface. With over 100 people involved in the operation, the task of bringing Sergey's remains to the surface required months of planning, funding, and approval from authorities. Each piece of Sergey's body was carefully prepared, ensuring that it could be safely transported through the winding, claustrophobic tunnels of the cave system. For the Veryovkina team, it was one of the most difficult operations they had ever undertaken. The sheer physical difficulty of climbing 3,600 feet while carrying Sergey's remains was immense, but the emotional burden was even greater. Each step reminded them of the dangerous nature of their passion and of the tragic end that Sergey had faced. For the Veryovkina team, Sergey's death was a stark reminder of the dangers they all faced as cavers. They had narrowly escaped death themselves just 2 years earlier, but this tragedy hit closer to home. It served as a sobering reality check for the entire caving community, a warning that even the most experienced adventurers could meet their end in the depths of the earth. Sergey Hozeev's death is a stark reminder of the dangers of extreme caving. Veryovkina, the world's deepest cave, is both awe-inspiring and deadly. His story shows the thin line between adventure and peril. May his story serve as a tribute to those who venture into the unknown, and a reminder that while the pursuit of adventure can take us to incredible heights or depths, it is always accompanied by risks that we must never underestimate.